Catherine Therese is an award-winning writer, designer, and educator who has had a diverse career in Europe and Australia, where she has lived, worked, and published widely across the arts. Her memoir, The Weight of Silence, was The Age and Sydney Morning Herald Book of the Year and finalist in the National Biography and ABIA Awards. In April this year, she released a novel, Things She Would Have Said Herself. We're going to talk about that, maybe some memoir writing, a few things. Hi, Catherine.
Fabulous. Hi, Sophie. How are you?
I'm great, and really looking forward to talking to you because you have written across fiction and non-fiction, and you work in the arts. I'm sure you have a few very interesting things to say. I'm going to first ask you about Things She Would Have Said Herself. Where did the idea come from?
Oh, gosh. It all started. Actually, the book is about a 70 or 8-year-old woman who's an irascible matriarch of a huge bonkers family. She will go to any length and breadth to ignore her own and her children's pain. And the book's deeply about that. It begins and ends in 2013. I had to place it that year because there was another thing that would get on Leslie Bird's goat. She's a woman with a lot of bugbears. And 2013 was the year we had 3 prime ministers. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Gillard, Rudd, Abbott.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a book about all the things that get on her goat. Leslie Bird was born in the 1930s, and she's inherited the doctrines and the orthodoxies of that time with absolutely no self-awareness. She's someone who carries a can of graphite powder in her pocket to ease squeaky door hinges, completely unaware that she's the most unhinged member of her family. She dubs her children. If she hears a word she doesn't like, she thinks that you take the word away and the meaning goes away and we can all just start again. She lives deeply in denial, and she's married to a fairly hapless chap, Wallace Bird. And the book actually, when you said the question, to answer your question, Sophie, where did the idea come from? Wallace Bird was the first character. That sounds like a cliche, but I had a dream about a little boy who was standing in a field of wheat, and wheat was all he could see. Wheat was his horizon, and it wasn't lost on me. This came to me in the aftermath of writing memoir.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a connection there's this beautiful thing that Anne Michaels says, one of my favorite authors, about one book. When you finish a book, it washes you up on the shore of the next. And I think whilst the memoir was also about family, it was about my family, it was about me having my first child at 16. And I broke a really long-standing family secret about my father's alcoholism. And the family was in a really strange stage of grief and understanding and misunderstanding, and it's a whole other conversation to have about the consequences of publishing memoir.
Right.
And Wallace Bird surfacing in the aftermath of the memoir, I think you can only ever look back. You keep all those unconscious doors locked while you're writing. But I think that Wallace Bird was an emblem of my parents' generation. He was a way in for me to try and understand them and others like them, born in the 30s in the Depression. In my dad's case, he inherited the Depression as a temperament, and poor old Wallace Bird does as well. And I placed him in Grenfell in the Riverina because I grew up obsessed, still am, read poetry every day, with Henry Lawson. And Lawson was born in Grenfell, and there was something about the syntax, the language. I felt like I'd found my people when I was I didn't really understand what I was reading Lawson, but there was a sadness, there was a melancholy. He was talking about people dying of the secrets they couldn't tell, and I was just off from that point, that this is a place I need to understand and be in. And so I guess it's not a coincidence that I placed this little boy in Grenfell, and I just started writing scenes about him. And at one point he grew up and I guess he needed a wife. And then Leslie Bird came along, and I really still can't explain her. She's a composite portrait of a lot of women I have observed and loved and known and have been outraged by. And my publisher said to me just before the book came out, this is a book about a generation that are leaving us, and they're taking their language and their stories with them, and it's a generation we roll our eyes at, but we're devastated when they're gone. So that's my intention. They're fairly disagreeable people, difficult people. I'm hell-bent on trying to understand anybody that's other to me. I think it's really easy to be benevolent and loving towards the people that mirror our own values. And so I'm trying to do the opposite, trying to understand people that are very different from my own way of being.
I have a few questions that have come out for what you've just said, but I'll start with the last part, which is I actually already had a question saying that, or a comment more, that it seems to me you write from a place of trying to understand the human condition and of great compassion for people in general. That you
Thanks.
like, you're an equal opportunity compassionate person. If that makes sense.
Do you know something? Probably certitude really bothers me, Sophie. I get really uncomfortable when people are when anyone's certain about anything. I gravitate towards, I guess, people who have a lot of space around them to accommodate the ideas of others. And I think as I get older, particularly in this time where, discourse can be so reductive, there's a lot of noise, and people are, I don't know, I feel as if we're living in an age where people are having tantrums when they come up against opinions or experiences that are different to their own. And I court difference, I think. I'm attracted to it. I'm really compelled to understand others, and I love ambiguity. I really love people who live in a way that kind of almost make an art of ambiguity. There's space for other opinions and ideas. And compassion. I mean, that's a beautiful word that you used. And when you think about the etymology, what it actually means, compassion is to suffer with. And I'm asking the readers to suffer along with this family, with the goal to hopefully, perhaps, because reading is an act of empathy in itself. When we read somebody else, we're joining a conversation. And I used to think it was a two-way conversation, half you, half me. But now I think, someone said to me the other day, oh, no, it's not. It's more than that. It's part me, part you, and part the times we're living in. The orthodoxies of the time we're living in now that are telling us how to read, what we should read. I've had people say to me, why would you write about these kind of people?
Right.
And I kind of know what they mean, but I feel like there's such a hierarchy in literature as to who gets written about and what sort of, I mean, is there or isn't there? Because I read really widely, and I can think of hundreds of books that are really talking about very ordinary lives and the extraordinary moments in those ordinary lives. So I haven't quite finished George Saunders' book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain. Have you read that, Sophie?
I haven't, no.
Oh, it's fabulous. He's at George has been teaching at Syracuse. Is that the way you pronounce it? I think university. And in the opening of his book, he's talking to his students. Apparently, there's thousands of people that apply, and he only takes 6 students a year. And the course that he teaches is based on his favorite, that he's writing about in this book at least, is 6 of his favorite Russian essays. And so you get the essay, and then you get a page of the essay, and then the following page is an examination of how you read that page. So in essence, it's an examination of how closely you're leaning into the text. What are you thinking? How are you responding? What's the author saying, not saying? And often it's what's in the slippage between the words, I think, and the sentences, which is where the deep meaning lies. And George is questioned by his students as to, who should we be writing about? And he says to them, every human life contains all the possibilities for good and evil, even the most humble life. Look around you. You don't have to look far to actually let go of judgment and just look at the people around you. And I guess I've grown up around people like the birds, have witnessed them at close quarters, and they are not my family. Leslie and Wallace Bird have their own pains and secrets and trajectories, but there's echoes, you know, they're sort of avatars for my concerns. Yeah.
You asked if there's a hierarchy of who gets written about. I think that difficult women often don't get written about because people push back against that. And I have had that experience where I've written characters who are difficult, not necessarily sympathetic, and had some pushback from sometimes from readers. And I think in making Leslie Bird, Leslie Bird being difficult, because you didn't make her anyway, she came to you. It's always interesting because we have women as villains, that's allowed. But women who are not nice. I mean, you can be evil, but you still, but not nice is a different kind of evil, I think.
It's so interesting, isn't it? I had someone say to me the other day, you know, oh, she's so shocking. And I thought, well, and I had to come back and say, tell me about what is so shocking about her to you, because I think there's a certain level of, you know, there is that it sort of speaks to how do we locate the truth in this situation and abandon our expectations of what a mother should be, what a woman should be. I mean, she's really disappointed. She bought all those doctrines of her time that motherhood and marriage would bring her happiness, and it's brought her great loss and disappointment. As a mother myself, I've got 3 children, and I couldn't imagine how someone could feel that way towards their children. And that was one of the things that really drew me into her, to try to inhabit that psychological space. What would it be like to feel demeaned by your children? But you're right, it's very, very provocative, isn't it, to have, you know, she hasn't killed anybody. She does a lot of tricky things. She's very complex, but she's deeply. Someone said to me the other day, the book reminded them of Mrs. Dalloway, but with poo. Mrs. Dalloway with lots of poo. And I said to them, yeah, actually, I'll take that, because there is a lot of there's a lot of soiling in the book, and as Leslie Bird would say, because the children aren't allowed to say the word poo, she makes them change it to the word pain. And there's a lot of pain in this book. And I've only just come to realize that perhaps there's so much pain in the book because of that thing of things she would have said as a writer. It's boiling up in me to try to say the things that she wouldn't say herself. And so I'm looking at all the ugly, messy stuff that happens. And especially, I think what I'm finding, even though it's only early days, Sophie, with the book out, people are quite terrified of all that messy stuff that resides inside us. You know, the molten lava, the stuff that's not politically correct, that can't be tamed, that's wild and chaotic.
It's not nice. In other words,
and the great challenge was to allow these people to say what they were thinking and get out of the road of judging them. And one of the things, it's just come to me now when you said before about what was the inspiration. Muriel Rukeyser is one of my favorite writers, and she has this beautiful, there's a quote that's attributed to her that is, what would happen if one woman told the truth of her life? The world would split open. And so there's a lot of worlds splitting open in this book, and it was terrifying to write. And it's actually quite, I didn't think I was as fearful this time, but I am, because you have to rely on other people's curiosity and engagement with their own empathy to want to understand a family like this and people like this. And when I use the word understanding, I think it's really important to mention that understanding doesn't mean forgiveness. You know, we're not condoning these actions. We're not encouraging them. Where my hope is that understanding allows us to get along a little bit better, to live more harmoniously within the realms of people that think differently to us. And I think context is critical always. You know, and nuance. We all need more shade, more nuance, because then when you're in possession of those things, you can't adhere to one ideological commitment, I guess. You leave yourself open.
Yeah. And when you were speaking earlier, I did note down some things. As I said, questions were coming out of that. So one of them was, you said, oh, perhaps it's a cliche, but Wallace came to you in a dream. I don't know that it is a cliche to dream a character, because I always find it extraordinary when people remember things that come to them in dreams. So are you someone who tends to document dreams or document ideas from dreams, or was that just a particularly significant dream?
Yeah, a bit of both, I think, Sophie. I've certainly had dreams in my life that were, they just have a quality that separates them from the usual kind of regurgitating dreams, where you sort of wake up and think, oh yeah, that all makes sense. I was, I have observed those things, and I can see how my mind has connected them. But this was, it was so, I've only had a handful of them in my life, and this was one of those where and the physicality of this chap, and actually they were both, Leslie and Bird came to me very physically when I realized who he was, this little boy, as he was getting older, and the kind of woman. Actually, the first thing that came to me with Leslie Bird were her ankles and her calves. I knew she'd have a big firm bottom and always be wearing steppings, but she had beautiful ankles and calves, and so I needed to get her to move around, and I actually cast her as a church organist, and then became very obsessed with, which might lead us into some of the musical stuff that we might talk about later, because I found myself ridiculously obsessed with organ music while I was writing the book. I think there's only like one or two mentions of it in the book, but isn't it funny, those preoccupations that we develop alongside our obsessions? And I can see now that it had something to do with rhythm. Rhythm's really important to me.
Yeah, well, I was actually about to say that, because when you were talking about poetry and Henry Lawson, I just made a note, because the rhythm of your language, there is so much musicality in the way you write. And so when you were talking about reading a lot of Lawson and now talking about rhythm in writing, because it's important to me as a writer to have rhythm, but it's so present in your writing, and it's this way of signifying to the reader what's going on. I think, shifting tempos, but also a way of drawing us in so that we feel like we're inside this beat that's going on. So for you, when you're writing initially, is that sense of rhythm there, or is it something that you only see when you're going back over it?
No, I can't get anywhere until I find the rhythm. The rhythm really, I mean, Wallace is an exception because there was such a sense of a physical presence, and I don't know, almost like a little ghost that was beside me, that I needed to investigate and love and understand. And the others' characters didn't come like that. They're metaphors. They're metaphors for all of the ways I wanted to challenge the main characters. The children that I've introduced have different characteristics, but rhythm always comes first for me. The words tumble to fit later. And I've got, some beautiful friends that are musicians, and a few of them have said to me that when I talk about writing, it's a similar kind of composition to them. Like it's a very physical process for me when I write longhand first, always.
Okay.
Yeah, hundreds of notebooks, and really scarily, when I look back at them, I think, oh God, I've been saying the same thing for years. Like, just rewriting the same sentence. I don't know what for, but maybe to get some depth of understanding. And then there's a point where it takes off. And when I'm actually at the computer, I write. It's kind of, the notebooks are there, and I don't really transcribe them. They're there, like the books I love are there on the desk as well. And something else happens. That's probably where the rhythm comes from, and it's during that sort of composition. Lyrical, and I think so much when we talk about rhythm it's the movement of your mind, the way that you think about things, and the way you make connections. are evident in the rhythm of your writing. And I've got a fairly associative way of thinking, so I kind of dart. Having read me, you would probably agree. I kind of dart around and I move in and out of the different consciousnesses of the characters, and hopefully they've got distinct rhythms.
Do they feel, when you're writing, because you have great dialogue, and I'm wondering if the characters therefore feel like they develop their own rhythms to you when you're writing that dialogue? I guess that's where it would be most evident. Yeah,
very much so. It's something, I don't know if we talk enough about, the practice, the discipline of writing. And it's something that I've worked really, really hard on. For me, writing primarily feels like listening to your thoughts, the characters, and kind of getting out of the way of what you think about things to find out what you don't know. And that's only when the unconscious can play, which is a bit like the dream state. I really feel like I'm not present when I'm talking about sort of early drafts when characters are coming into formation. I'm walking around, with Leslie Bird's gait and ankles, and going to lunchtime recitals at St Andrews in Macquarie Street in Sydney. It's so fantastic. They're free. They're on every Thursday, and you can just sit up the back and be really quiet and listen. And the physicality of all of that, there was something. I only actually wrote one scene about her sitting at the organ, but I think I was attempting to suggest that there was something dormant and erotic and wonderful, all this potential in this woman that never gets realized. And even if it was only in flexing her ankles at the keyboard, I mean, she never speaks to any of the congregation that at this church that she plays at for 30 years. She never speaks to anyone. She plays the organ, then she sits up the back and kind of looks at everybody from behind and judges them, and, just carries on with her small-minded thinking.
Yeah. But that's back to also you having compassion for your characters, regardless of who they are when they come to you. You saw all of that potentially in her. Yeah. And I guess writing is a way to try to find that in the characters, find the potential, even if you know that they're not destined to manifest any of that.
Yes. And I have to say, I didn't really know her. I didn't know the trajectory. I write scenes, and I guess key for me with Leslie Bird is what happens to her when she's a little girl, being shamed. I think she's 9 years old when she's made aware she's swimming at the Macquarie River in Bathurst. She holds the record for holding a breath underwater, and then all these kids make fun of her and about a physical ailment that she has that she's been mildly aware of, but at that point it's life-changing for her. Her father comes to the river and, with the best of intentions, tells her to cover herself up quick, smart, and busy herself elsewhere. And because she's a good girl, she does. It could actually be the title of the book. Cover yourself up and busy yourself elsewhere. Keep yourself nice, as her mother used to say to her. Keep yourself nice. So she excels at that. And one of the things I'm really interested in is what it's like to live in a body. If we think of the body as our first home, what's it like to actually be disembodied? For your home, for your first home, your body to be a foe, not a soup, but an enemy. To be a hostile place. And this is a woman who's never experienced her body as a place of pleasure. She abhors sex. She sees the world through this lens of, she carries this fear with her all the time that something awful and ugly is going to be exposed, and she does everything to cover it up, and she covers up all her feelings about things with no knowledge that she's passing on all of that dogma and ideology to her children, that they're absorbing all of this. And of course they grow up to do all sorts of wacky things with little awareness of what they've inherited and why.
Because girls are socialized, I think, probably even still, to have that disembodiment. It's just that sense of, our bodies are not meant to belong to us, they belong to everyone else. Everyone can comment on them. We need to look a certain way in order to appease how other people think of us. It is such a common experience, which is why in being specific about Leslie's experiences, you make them universal. And I also was interested in something you said about, characters who are, as she was born during the Depression. I'm actually quite conscious as well of us losing that sense of the generations who lived through wars and the Depression, and how they acted out of that and made some decisions that we wouldn't necessarily understand today, which have possibly turned into intergenerational trauma and decisions. But that is seeping out of our consciousness, and I'm quite aware of trying to keep some of those characters in as well.
Yeah, I think it's, and again, we spoke before, Sophie, about context. When I was doing research for the book, I actually took my mum and dad, who were well in their 80s at this point, I took them to Grenfell when I was researching. There's a terrible accident that happens in Wallace's childhood in the book, and I wasn't familiar with Grenfell aside from, I'd never placed myself there, so I needed to walk the streets, have a mixed grill in the pub, and look at all these bandy-legged old shearers, and Mum and my parents actually from a different place in the Riverina. Both of them spent a lot of time in Cootamundra, and Dad was from a shearing family. His mother was a shearer's cook, and like Wallace in the book, he left school at 15, had all his teeth put out, and started smoking in a trade on the same day. And what struck me so profoundly, there's mention of the Cowra breakout in the book. And we stopped on our way to Grenfell in Cowra, and Mum and Dad had both lived through that time. Dad told stories when he was, about being a little boy and hearing about knowing that the Japanese were being interned in Cowra. One of his family members, a great uncle, was actually one of the gunners at Cowra. So there was this kind of mythology and idea in our family that there was some connection there, which drew me to it as well. I took Mum and Dad to, there's an amazing hologram exhibition. It's a reenactment. It's kind of like a little garage almost next to a service station in Cowra. And there's this Dad loved it so much, he's like, yeah, let's watch it again, because he gleaned more information from that hologram than actually living through it, watching bodies piled up, all of that, because, and it really puts you in mind as to how information was disseminated, what they were hearing about the war. When I took them to the cemetery there, which is magnificent for anyone who hasn't been, it's an incredible part of our history, and the unity between the Japanese and Australian governments, and how the physicality of the place, the gum trees circled by cherry blossoms. It gives me goosebumps just remembering it. And Dad was absolutely astonished that any of this had taken place, because he knew so little about it, because the news was kept from them. There was the occasional headline, but information was controlled. You didn't have a phone, you didn't have, So, and it's interesting that we kind of stand in judgment now of those people and their attitudes, when the Japanese surfaced in Sydney Harbour, and there were shells that went into, I live in Paddington, and just recently I've had a look at some of the properties that were damaged in Woollahra and nearby. And, when I was born in 65, the White Australia policy was in place. They were terrified of the yellow peril. And through ignorance, through closed lives, through parochial thinking, they didn't venture beyond pretty much the East Coast. And those ideas just kind of became deeply embedded. And so, I've been trying to understand that sort of bigotry, its roots, its projections, and its consequences. So there's a whole lot of aspects like that surface in the book. I've created children with, to try to explore intergenerational trauma, and
and again, from a place of deep compassion and wanting to understand the human condition, I think. And I'm interested I'm interested in what the differences might have been for you between writing memoir and writing this novel. And obviously memoir, you're drawing on your own life, but even just practically, were there differences in how you went about the writing tasks for each?
No, I don't think so. In terms of my habits for writing, the way I approach it, except to say that I write deeply from feeling. I'm just obsessed with finding words for feelings, and that was a distinct difference for me between memoir and fiction, that the feelings were all inside me, and so the job was to articulate them. When I was creating fictional characters, and I think this is probably why it took a decade,
Right.
I almost felt like I had to become these people, ingest them, so then they were inside me and I could write about them from feeling as if they were my lived experience. And it's really weird, Sophie. I shared the development of the characters with mum and dad and one of my sisters as we, as the years were passing. And in some ways, I think I needed to know that they were freed from my biography and these characters were standing on their own. And there were times where Leslie Bird was quoted in the family, but she was being quoted as somebody else, and I go, no, she's not real. That's Leslie Bird. That's my character. That's not what Arnie such and such said. She kind of became this presence in our lives it was very, very strange. And I think, as I said, I think it's why it took so long, because I still had to write from feeling of these characters, walk around inside them. And it's funny, when you publish memoir, my experience was that people say, oh, you're saying it's memoir, but is it really you? There's this kind of doubt that, I don't know, I got questioned a lot about that. Certainly not by my family, who found the whole experience very painful, but there was never any suggestion that what I'd written about wasn't, true. It's just they kind of everyone got in a really sort of landed in a good place when they could deny it existed, sort of, till we got to the point where it was like, what book? Oh yeah, now we'll just move on, and we'll forget about that. It's I can't imagine going back to nonfiction. I'm writing again now, and there's a lot of space between the words. I think it could be poetry that's surfacing now.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Just you talking about ingesting your characters, because you're writing memoir, you can't let yourself go. You can't de-ingest yourself. I'm wondering if you have let go of the birds, or if you ever will, if you haven't yet.
That's a really generous, beautiful question, because it just shows how deeply you're calibrated as a writer, Sophie, to ask that, because they do. Like my husband said to me just recently, I said to him, well, it's nothing to walk around, like inside the body of a, 78-year-old cranky woman for all these years. And he said, yeah, tell me about it. Like, next time, could you write a book about a woman who wants to have sex with her husband all the time? And I do. You kind of go a bit mad, I think, when you're doing this sort of thing. Sorry, what was your question, Sophie?
It was whether you feel that you'll be able to let, or if you can let them go once they're in you. I mean, I tend to think characters do hang around forever, but just from a place of pure practicality, for you to function in the world as Catherine.
I think I'm good. It's really interesting, the time lapse between. It's quite a challenge, actually, even talking about the book, because I'm so wary of making fiction of the fiction. Right. I kind of wish that, because the part of me that wrote the book is not this part. It's not me. I know what I think about things. I don't know what I think about things when I'm writing. It surprises me, which is part of why I do it, I guess. But there's a lapse of a couple of years between me handing the manuscript in and it being published. So my understanding of my intentions with the book and all of those things have changed. And I didn't know, without any spoilers or anything for the book, I didn't know how it was going to end. I really didn't know. It surprised me.
It's a strange fractious existence.
Part of them will always be with me, because in some ways too, it feels like all the characters in me and all of them aren't me. And if that duality can exist, that like your ideas, there's a line in the book where someone suggests to Leslie Bird she's having an awful thought about something, and it's suggested to her that she's not her thoughts. And she says, and someone says, oh, you should write them down on a piece of paper and set them on fire and then they'll be gone. And she thinks to herself, no, I definitely have my thoughts. And the whole world would ignite if it really knew what women were thinking.
Yeah.
And it's funny, people who, you know, in my close circle who know me have sort of, you know, oh, is that such and such? And, you know, people who know me and my world. And it's really funny. There are actually a couple of characters who are kind of avatars for a couple of people that I know, and they are the people who, you know, because they don't have self-awareness, they don't recognize them at all. And it's funny when people try to cast themselves as other characters, which is endlessly fascinating in itself.
It is, yes. I have had that happen on occasion. And it's so, and again, it's the people who ask, I'm like, that person is completely not you. Like, it's just, in fact, no character is you.
Yes.
Like
Yeah. And it is that, isn't it? You know, I got asked the other day about loss. You know, there's a loss of a child in this book that has a profound impact on Leslie Bird's development. And, you know, I was asked, you know, how, and this is by a woman who is a journalist, but she's also, she was a doctor in emergency, and she wanted to talk to me about writing a scene about losing a child. And she said, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I said, no, it hasn't happened to me, but it happened to somebody when I had my son. When I was 16, there was a woman who was brought into the ward very heavily pregnant, and she was induced. And the night before she went in to be induced, I spent the night with her, with my son, you know, brand new. And the nurses asked if she could hold him. And as it transpired, she never came back from giving birth. She was moved to the general ward. And a couple of days later, I found out through a pink lady, you know, serving tea and biscuits. She was taking this woman's clothes out of the wardrobe, and she said, baby born blue.
Right.
And he was born 2 days after my son. So who's just turned 40. So for the last 40 years, I sort of say a prayer and light a candle for that little baby that never made it out into the world. And that her loss, I don't know, I've carried it with me alongside my son all these years. And if I, you know, it's so weird, isn't it, when you start unpicking these obsessions of ours. Can I share with you something, Sophie, that the amazing film director Catherine Millard shared with me very, very early on. I was staying at Varuna, and she was there with me, and we were talking about our obsessions. You know, because I think when you say to writers, what are you writing about? Sometimes we make up stuff, we don't know, we're confused about our intentions and what we've actually done. But if you ask them what their obsessions are, you get pretty close to what they're writing about. And she said to me, she's so droll and dry and everything, and she said, I'm monogamous in my relationships, but not my obsessions. I always have the thing I'm obsessed with, and then I have one coming up the rear.
Great.
Isn't it? And I just think, you know, something to do, something to think about, something to hope for, like those of us who are calibrated towards making and creating. It's so important to, you know, there's characters that are sort of there. I can hear them twittering around even while we're talking for future projects, which is pretty weird, isn't it?
Do you, when you have the characters twittering around like that, do you actually document anything, or do you just trust that they're going to stay with you?
Yeah, no, I do. I wake up, or I'm a bit like, for want of another description, I suppose it's fairly well documented, the whole morning pages thing. I like, I can't remember who said this. It might have been Toni Morrison. I read a quote recently that, you know, when you become a mother, you cease to be the protagonist in your own life. And I think, you know, I kind of habitually had to be up and writing before anyone said the word mum. Right. Because then that just took my whole identity. I had to be just me and not me at the same time. So writing really early in the morning's been a big habit of mine for many years. I'm a morning person. I love to greet the dawn. I love the privacy of morning. What it allows me, the space. And I've been really lucky. I mentioned Varuna before. It's the Writers' House in Katoomba. I've had numerous residencies there over the last kind of 10 years. And I always write in the same room. It's Eleanor Dark's writing room out in the garden, and it's got a beautiful view of the garden, and depending on what time of year you're there, you get to see the apple blossoms and the azaleas and everything. And I get in there and I draw the curtains and I turn the lights off, and it's just the light of the computer, because I just feel like I'm not in this world. I'm in the world of my characters.
Right. Now, you've documented some of your process, and I always love hearing about process, and this podcast is partly about process. I'm wondering, now I'll move to the general questions portion of talking to you, which is, do you have a tip for anyone who wants to start writing and isn't sure how to begin?
Yeah, it's one of the most important things that anyone ever said to me is like, just keep your bum in the seat. Just keep your bum in the seat, turn up and be, really disciplined about it. You will be rewarded. I mean, I'm not a person who's ever counted words on the page. I was mentioning Varuna before, you come in at night and spend time with other writers, and people would say, oh, I did 3,000 words today. And I'd think, oh, shit, I've bloody moved a full stop. That's all I've done. But in the thinking that's taken place, something's shifted, something's moved, and I might be just in my room doing all sorts of weird things, thinking about the characters, and then I find my way kind of into the rhythm. Just going back to process for a second, Sophie, I just wanted to mention, because when I have mentioned it before with other writers that I've mentored or had the pleasure of spending time with, everybody tells me it's incredibly weird thing that I do. So it might be worth mentioning. I write in different colours.
I understand that.
Do you?
I've got a color-coded, I don't write in different colors, but I have a color-coded grid, as I call it. It's a table in Microsoft Word. Yeah, so I understand that.
Wow. Well, I just, not in my notebooks, everything's like black and white. So like, just like the usual sort of crap. But when it gets up onto the computer, the work has a feeling, and the feeling has a color. So if it's tepid, it might be yellow. I can't stand, I suppose the feelings and the things that I write about that I feel most uncertain about and anxious will usually be in yellow and green. And things that I feel strongly about might be in red or dark blue. And the object is to get them all, to turn them into black. And when I hand it over to my beautiful publisher, who encourages me all the way along with all these wacky proclivities, they only ever hand over black stuff. And then I fight for every sentence, every space, every break. I'll fight for everything, because I know the rainbow of thinking that it's gone through. And I have a background in visual arts. I work as a stylist and designer, and I didn't realize, I was doing an interview many years ago with Julianne Schultz, who's incredibly thoughtful in her reading. And she said to me, she asked me during an interview, I want to talk to you about the design of your writing. And I said, I don't know what you mean. And she said, oh, yes, like it's, and as we started talking about it, I thought, oh, God, she's absolutely right in terms of unconsciously I'm using the elements and principles of design.
Right.
Things have to be balanced. There's repetition, there's scale, there's, and the way that I would approach decorating a room is kind of how I feel about a scene. And I was really, it was completely unconscious to me that I was doing that, but I can see very clearly now that that's a reflection of, again, like the contours of my thinking and my being comes out, as it does for all of us, doesn't it?
It does. I'm stuck on yellow and green. I'm interested what happens. So when you color yellow or green, and when you go back to it, is it to question whether you really want to have it in, or is it to see how you can get it to black?
Yeah. They're probably the ideas that are sort of, that feel the most flimsy, sometimes contrived, like you're trying too hard. They don't feel organic. And it's really funny, the things, there are passages, there are whole, especially dialogue. It's interesting when I look back at editing, working with, wonderful editors, very little of the dialogue has ever changed.
Right.
Very little. And most of it comes out black. It's sort of not, it almost feels like it's not disputable for me. It just is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's those joining pieces when you're trying to, when it comes to structure and all those things, and you feel like things are too contrived, or you're working on something too hard, and it's sort of like yellow is me being shy on the page or something. Like, I'm really not sure about this. It doesn't really deserve to be there. But if I've written something in black, I know you know my publisher well, she'll tell you I fight till the last little comma and full stop to explain it and its relevance and necessity in the book.
So it's interesting because you have musicality in your life, you have design elements, you write. These are actually things that don't necessarily all go together because they're different aspects of the mind. Often people focus on one. I think either you're a visual or you're musical, whatever it is. So for you, in terms of how you experience the world and how you tell your stories, do you feel like it's just a sense of harnessing everything at your disposal to pour into a book, or do you have other outlets for your
plenty of other outlets? I have a design studio in Paddington, so I've worked as a stylist and a designer for the last 30 odd years in Europe and Australia, and I would argue that it's all about telling a story. And when I was 16 and unmarried mother and trying to make ends meet, it's too long a story, but I ended up sort of doing this little makeup course, and I was doing makeup, started off there, and I was always trying to tell a story, whether it was with someone's face. When I'm doing styling, working in commercial or residential projects, it was about articulating who my clients were in a three-dimensional sense. Right. It's always about telling a story. And so writing feels really similar to me in that way, that you're constrained by the page. You've got the page to be able to articulate who these characters are, but it all feels very connected to me with the impetus of storytelling. That's the link for me, is that I wrote my first, I thought it was a book, and it was probably just a pamphlet or some rubbish, when I was 4, and it was a little story called The Naughty Girl, and it was my first attempt at fiction. I've still got it. Dad was a builder, and he used to get the PGH Brickworks, used to give him diaries every year, and it's 1969. I've written in this diary this naughty Norty girl story, which is pretty scary when I look back at it and think I was perceiving things then about injustices and things that weren't being said around me, and I was attempting to do them even at that age. It's so weird, isn't it? So I think I'm a storyteller.
I'd agree with that. And I also think you live a full spectrum life, in that you look for the beauty and richness in all aspects of life. So as I was saying, visual, musical, whatever it is, and that is present on the page because we feel like we enter a full spectrum world when we read your novel. And I could have you talking for hours because you are such an interesting person to talk to, but I am going to have to wrap it up. I'm going to ask you one last question about music, since this is a books and music podcast. Now, you do know a lot of musicians. You have a broad listening range, but I'm wondering if you have favorite artist or artists you'd like to share with us.
A musical artist?
Yes, musical artist, yes.
Gosh.
You don't have to pick one because it's a tough question.
Gosh, that's really hard, isn't it?
Or maybe I should say instead, who are you listening to at the moment, or what are you listening to at the moment?
Oh, what am I listening to at the moment? Gosh, I have to make a confession. I went and saw Harry Styles. I love Harry's house.
You say that like it's a bad thing. That guy's
no, I just, honestly, Sophie, it was, we've talked quite a bit about compassion and kindness and nuance and everything, and I can't tell you how I've always had a little thing for him. I just love,
I totally understand.
And it's not a little thing, it's a big thing. I got a big thing for Harry. And my daughter and I went to see him in Melbourne, and we couldn't get tickets in Sydney. And it was just, we were there for the weekend, and it felt as if the whole of the city was imbued with this kindness. There was a woman who was 70, same age as Leslie Bird, weirdly, 78, a grandmother on her own at the concert with her feather boa, and she was rocking out the whole time. And I just thought, there's something that he emits that's, I don't know, in being true to himself, that's so authentic that it kind of encourages other people to be so joyful. And it just felt like a safe, kind, wonderful place. And I've become obsessed with, do you know Zane Lowe?
No, I don't.
Oh, so good. I'm so glad to bring him up. He does musical interviews on Apple. He's got an amazing back.
Hang on, I did see him interview Taylor Swift. Yes.
Okay.
Now it's yes.
Well, you have to jump on and watch the Harry ones, because he talks to them deeply about the writing of the songs and the music and where they are and how it happens and where they are at this time in their life. So, but I wasn't actually listening to Harry during the writing of the book. I was listening to a lot of Sarah McLachlan, London Grammar.
Yeah.
Steve Balby, who's just someone I treasure as an amazing storyteller. His voice moves me incredibly. His album Black Rainbow I listened to a lot writing this book. But Bach, which really surprised me, the fugues. I stumbled upon a book called Bach's Feet, which is actually about the 280-mile, like, just take that in for a second, 280-mile walk that he did from Lubeck to, I don't know where it was. He was intrigued by this organ player, and as part of his development, he thought he needed to get there and have a look at this organ, and ended up in a big kerfuffle when he got there, and it was formative to his life. But the book's very much about how he walked as he walked his feet kind of, there was this rhythm in his walking, and then later in his playing that was all connected. It was bodily, it was to do with the world, about being out in the world, bringing the world inside you. And I actually listen to a lot of orchestral music. I still do.
Yeah.
And organ music, like, if you haven't been to go and sit, if you're in Sydney and you want to go and have a beautiful lunchtime, you can sit up the back with your Vita Weeks in your little plastic bag and listen to these organists. It's so moving, and it's so physical, the whole thing. So yeah, I heard. Did anyone come out on top? Not really.
I think again, full
Renee
spectrum.
Gayer, as an ode to her passing recently, I've been listening to her a lot. Right. What a talent.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. But I think as your musical taste is full spectrum as well. And I really appreciate it. Catherine, you've brought so much joy and beauty to me in this conversation. So I hope that everyone listening will go and buy. I think she would have said herself, and read it, borrow it from the library, whatever. It's a wonderful piece of work. Congratulations. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for having me.